Normandy, 1944. In one of the Second World War's greatest showdowns, the American M4 Sherman, the finest tank the Allies possessed, went head-to-head with the most destructive tank ever built, Germany's Panzerkampfwagen 6, the Tiger. The Normandy campaign involved 7,000 tanks and changed the course of history. But which of these two was superior? We're going to settle the matter once and for all. In the weeks following the D-Day landings, Allied forces are desperate to beat a path into mainland Europe. Concealed in the Normandy hedgerows, the defending Germans have the ultimate weapon to stop them in their tracks. What do you give a man who has everything? In Hitler's case, it was this, the mighty Tiger tank, unveiled on his 53rd birthday in April 1942. And on the Führer's directive, it was to be bigger, heavier, and more powerful than any tank ever built before. The Tiger was 56 tons and equipped with the biggest gun to be fitted to a mass-produced tank at the time. With its sheer size and devastating firepower, it soon took on mythical status amongst enemy Allied crews.
I looked upon it as something indestructible, and if it was everywhere you went, if you passed a wood on your flank, say 1,000 yards away, you'd wonder what was lurking in there.
The fact was, it was a Tiger which was dominant in crews' minds. I'm sure people saw Tigers when they weren't there.
If he sees you, you haven't got a chance, have you? If you see him, you still haven't got a chance.
Meanwhile, the Americans had been working on a design of their own. The brief was for a versatile tank capable of armored support in a variety of combat arenas. It was better than anything the Allies had come up with before. It was called the M4, or as the Allied crews came to know it, the Sherman.
My first impression of the Sherman, I thought was brilliant because the maneuverability of it, and as a driver, it had such a wonderful compartment, controls were good, and I honestly, my first impression, I couldn't fault the Sherman, really. I was very impressed with it.
Such were the Sherman's glowing commendations to begin with, that it soon became the tank chosen for mass production and use by all the Allied forces, the Americans, Canadians, British, and eventually even the Russians. And when on June the 6th, 1944, the Allies needed a tank for the D-Day landings, there was no contest. It had to be the Sherman, trusted by crews and infantry alike. But nobody had told the troops about the Tiger.
Of course, we didn't know then what the Germans had, really.
No, but I was going to say, I don't think then I knew anything about Tigers.
Well, no,
at that stage.
They didn't tell us much about the Tiger.
No, they didn't, until we saw this Tiger, which had been captured. And it had 20 to 25 shell marks on it, where it hadn't penetrated. And then, of course, when you saw other tanks, other Shermans burn in front of you, you know, sort of not your confidence about a bit.
And I used to count the graves, because they were often then just buried behind the tank or somewhere. And you'd see 2, 3, 5, and it was a 5, of course, they'd all gone. And that's really where my confidence began to slip a bit.
So, was the Allied Sherman inferior to the Tiger? And did the Tiger really live up to its fearful legend? To create the Tiger, the Germans shoehorned their highly successful 88mm anti-aircraft gun into an armored body to produce an awesome tank-killing package. However, the Sherman wasn't primarily designed to be a tank killer, as its smaller diameter, quick-loading artillery gun made it ideal for infantry support roles. But for the D-Day landings, Allied commanders needed a tank to take on the Tiger, and the Sherman was the best they had. And that's why there was an enormous disparity in size and power between the two tanks' guns, not to mention the rounds they fired. Just look at these shells. This is the 75mm diameter round of the Sherman. Okay, that looks pretty scary, but take a look at this monster. This is the 88mm round that the Tiger fired. The damage caused by one of these was absolutely devastating. In short, the Tiger's gun was bigger and more powerful in every way, capable of destroying a Sherman at 1,500 meters. A Sherman's gun would have absolutely no impact at anything over 300 meters and would have to get within a 60-meter range to have a real chance of taking out the Tiger. There was no greater example of the Tiger's superior firepower than at the Battle of Goodwood, 6 weeks after the D-Day landings. Perched on a hill overlooking the advancing Allies, the Germans' 88s destroyed a staggering 400 Shermans before they could get close enough to fire a shot on target. These men were there, on opposite sides, Ken Tout in a Sherman and Heinz Bleidiesel in a Tiger. Over the 2 days of carnage, Heinz's Tiger troop wiped out at least a dozen Shermans.
20 to 25 Shermans appeared, and we started to fire when the range was optimal, and every round hit a Sherman and they went up in flames.
Yes.
In a few minutes, it took us 30 minutes for 12 Shermans, and the other 2 had bailed out, they were undamaged.
Just as important as firepower was a tank's armor, and the Tiger had a head start here too, as military vehicle specialist Tony Lawrence explains.
The armour of the Tiger varied in thickness depending on what part of the tank. The frontal armour was up to about 4 inches thick, the side armour less, and the turret armour less. Even so, the frontal armour was impervious to pretty well anything that the Allies could throw at it. Really, the Tiger was a mobile pillbox.
To keep the Sherman lighter, the Americans used much thinner armor. In fact, almost half the thickness of the Tigers. To show the difference this makes, we've come to an ordnance testing range on Salisbury Plain. We've set up an experiment to replicate the effects of a direct hit from an 88mm round on the 2-inch thick side armor plating of a Sherman tank. But the real story is the potential damage to the crew inside, represented by these targets. We've also set up high-speed video cameras to record the impact and show how well the armor stands up to the modern equivalent of a Tiger's deadly firepower. Take a look at this.
Confirm range clear all round.
Range clear all round, video ready.
Stand by. 3, 2, 1.
Yeah, the effects are devastating. The armor plating's just too thin to withstand the awesome power from an armor-piercing round fired from a gun like the Tiger's 88. It's punched straight through. And as for the crew, the high explosive and metal have sliced right through the crew and out the other side. Tiger tanks mainly fired armor-piercing shells, which would penetrate the skin of the Sherman. Then, a hard metal core would bounce around the interior, slicing through anything in its path. In other words, the Sherman crew. The chances of surviving an impact like this during the Second World War were practically nil.
We were advancing through an orchard, but when we got to the edge of the orchard, I heard a gun was firing, which sounded like an 88. And I looked across about sort of 200 yards, and I could see a gun. Suddenly the camouflage came off it a bit, and they were firing at someone else's tank. Possibly Nobby's or the other one next to it. I sort of came a bit out of the trees, and then I could see that the gun was beginning to swivel around towards us. And of course, eventually, it was facing directly at our tank. We were sort of looking down the muzzle. And the next minute it fired and struck our tank up just above the right track. As it entered the tank, first thing I noticed was the shaft was light as it had punched through, and it was an almighty bang, as you may imagine. That was about, I suppose, this much from me, about a yard across the tank, and only about a foot from the co-driver. It struck the ammunition bin, went white hot, and then it shot out underneath and broke the track. But we all got out and we all survived. Extremely lucky. Must have been our lucky day.
Few were as fortunate as Brian, and those who did live to tell the tale often had the unenviable task of cleaning up the remains of fellow Sherman troopers, as Wally Tarrant remembers.
The biggest part was down in Lisieux, where we lost 4 tanks in one street. So I come down because I knew them all, you know, and we went into the tank to try and see if we could find anybody we knew, and that was terrible, you know. You found a pair of shoes, and is that Track Pin Walsh? I thought. I said, he had big feet. I thought that must be him, you know. And then the driver I knew, and I thought, that's the driver. He said, yeah, but we got to be sure of it. Find his tag, you know. And a lot of them was just called missing.
But a Tiger taking a direct hit from a Sherman round was a different story. Its 4-inch thick armour protected the crew from almost anything the Allies had to throw at them.
When you were hit, let's say by a Sherman, you thought there was a lightning in your tank for a few seconds, except that sometimes I was thrown back a little bit. But afterwards, it was as if nothing had happened.
650.
For the moment, Tiger crews could sit tight in the knowledge that no gun the Allies possessed could pierce their armour. But all that was about to change. In the weeks after the D-Day landings, Allied Sherman tanks had been decimated by the awesome firepower of the German Tiger tank force. But stories of Shermans taking out Tigers with their comparatively small 75mm guns were few and far between. That was until a British innovation turned the Sherman into a tank that could challenge the Tiger head-on. The Firefly.
The Firefly was a last-minute, desperate attempt to put a really decent gun into the Sherman tank. And the British had available the 17-pounder, which was more or less equivalent to the Tiger's 88mm. They tried to put it into the Sherman, found it wouldn't fit. And in the end, ingeniously, they got it fitted into the turret by doing a 90 degrees twist, and they were able to insert it into the rather smaller turret of the Sherman.
This is the Sherman as it was originally developed with a 75mm gun. This is the Sherman Firefly with a 17-pounder anti-tank gun. The pea shooter, the tank killer.
That ought to give them something to think about.
But it was too little too late. The Sherman Firefly was never built in big numbers, mainly because the Americans were reluctant to fit a foreign gun in their tanks. Only 1 in 4 British Shermans ever housed the Tiger-killing 17-pounder. But there were other areas where the Sherman was beginning to gain superiority over the Tiger. At almost twice the weight of the Sherman, the Tiger could only reach a top speed of 23 miles per hour. The Sherman was much faster, and could go places the larger Tiger would just get stuck in.
Shermans are very mobile. They were a reasonably fast tank. I've actually been in the Sherman getting up to about 30 miles an hour, which is quite a hairy experience. In the Sherman, you could go along any normal metalled road, cross country. The Tigers were much, much slower, but also, of course, their weight told against them. At 56 tons, it's fine going along nice, flat, dry ground. Once you start getting into mud, they're going to sink. Once you start going over small bridges, the bridges are going to crumble.
The Sherman was perhaps much better, much faster. Our maneuverability was really inadequate. No? And the engine was too slow. The horsepower was not enough.
And it wasn't just on the move that the Sherman was faster than the Tiger. Its turret could turn much quicker too, an advantage that could mean the difference between life and death on the battlefield.
If you compare it with the Sherman, I would say the Sherman was much better. It took us 3 to 5 minutes turning the turret round by hand, and perhaps 2 minutes or 1.5 minutes by engine.
As far as design is concerned, there are 3 features to balance in the quest for tank perfection: firepower, armor, and mobility. As we've seen, the Tiger won hands down when it came to firepower and armor, while the Sherman had the mobility. But the Sherman also had something else. It had the full weight of the American automobile industry behind it. And believe it or not, this car would hold the key to the eventual domination of the Sherman over the Tiger on the battlefield.
Here in the Detroit tank arsenal, we forged the armaments of victory.
For the Normandy landings, the US government stepped up production of the Sherman by instructing the big 3 car manufacturers, General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford, to take control. As a result, new Sherman tanks rolled off the assembly lines, using components taken directly from the car industry. For example, this Ford Pilot's V8 engine was also fitted to some Sherman tanks. This interchangeability of parts, simple design, and huge manufacturing backup meant that in Normandy, destroyed Shermans could be replaced within 36 hours.
When I was knocked out, I went straight back and they gave me a Sherman straight away, get back up.
The Germans just didn't have that sort of backup. It can be argued that Hitler's folly was to have commissioned such an enormous and complicated tank like the Tiger, when much simpler tanks could have been produced in greater number. Sheer madness when you realize that for every 1 Tiger coming off the production line, the Germans could have afforded 3 of these, smaller, but still absolutely lethal Panzer Mark IVs.
They lost the plot a bit. And this is the problem with all of their industry. They were still producing grandiose products right up to 1945, when they should have just concentrated on some of their proven successes and just concentrating on getting those out as quickly as possible.
The Tiger was a complex, over-engineered machine which shared few common parts with any other German tank. This meant that it took a long time to make, had more to go wrong, and had very poor spares backup when it did break down. In the field of combat, a minor fault could disable the Tiger, and unlike the Sherman, a dead Tiger could not easily be replaced.
We had lots of engine trouble. In my Le Corps, after 100 yards, it was already broken down. So we had to wait for people to get it running again, who never came, by the way. You know? The war ended before they actually arrived.
With the Sherman vastly superior in numbers, the Allied military strategists finally devised a way for Sherman troops to beat the Tiger.
Imagine a little scenario in Normandy. We have a Tiger tank here, sitting up in a hedgerow, hidden from the Allies. We have a troop of 4 Shermans crossing a field. The first one, his turret will be turning. They'll be on the lookout for anything suspicious. The Tiger would take him out straight away with 1 shot. The second Sherman, he'll realise there's an enemy gun or something in the hedgerow. He will probably try and aim a shot towards the hedgerow, roughly where he thinks whatever it is might be. But by then the Tiger has reloaded and has taken this one out. The third tank, he will have seen the Tiger by now. He will try and use his other tanks as shield. He will come round. He might be able to get a shot off. And he will make a beeline for a sunken ravine over on the other side. But by then the Tiger will have reloaded. He will have gone. In the meantime, the fourth member of the troop, seeing what's happening, he will know the only vulnerable spot on the Tiger is the rear. He will try and go round to the rear of the tank and he will try and take out the Tiger from the rear. And we have one Sherman out of 4 surviving.
But of course, it wasn't just the Shermans being sacrificed for the greater good. It was the Sherman crews, too.
I felt very expendable, especially when we landed in Normandy. And when you see so many casualties in Normandy, and every day we were having casualties, you did feel, is my number next, you know?
In the end, it was a numbers game. The Sherman was produced in massive numbers, almost 50,000 of them, but fewer than 1,400 Tigers were built. Allied military strategists realized, perhaps rather callously, that even if it took 4 or 5 Shermans to knock out one Tiger, they could be replaced easily, whereas a Tiger couldn't. In this respect, the Sherman was superior. But if you asked soldiers on both sides which tank they'd rather have fought in, you'd find out pretty quickly which was their tank of choice.
But I think I'd better say the Tiger.
I'd rather be in a Tiger myself.
I'd have to say it'd be the Tiger.
I think I'd go for the Tiger.
There's no question about it. I would always choose the Tiger.
But the might of the American manufacturing sector meant that there was always a Sherman left over. And this meant that the Sherman won this great military clash.